we begin today at the White House, where officials are still denying that President Donald Trump had any prior knowledge of allegations that Russia offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants for the deaths of American troops, reported first by the New York Times. Multiple news outlets report U.S. officials provided information in a written briefing to the president months ago that Russia may be rewarding and encouraging killings of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. But now the Associated Press says some top officials may have been aware of the situation even earlier. For more on this, let's bring in Zeke Miller. He's a CBS News political contributor and a White House reporter for the Associated Press. Zeke, good to see you. So what can you tell us about what we know so far about knowledgeable officials at the White House and how knowledgeable they were around this situation when it first arose way back in early 2019?
There are two important parallel revelations in this reporting by my colleague James Laporta late last night. One is that the intelligence surrounding the bounties that the intelligence committee concludes that Russia was placing on American soldiers, that intelligence, some of that stemmed back more than a year ago, and that there were briefings. His reporting is that the president was briefed by former National Security Advisor John Bolton in March of last year in the midst of U.S. negotiations and discussions about an Afghan troop drawdown and negotiations with the Taliban. So that's one aspect. The other is more broadly, and this gets at the important context in all of this reporting surrounding the bounties, is that Russian mischief making and meddling and malign activities in Afghanistan and elsewhere is nothing new. They're sort of, it's a spectrum. It's sometimes it's dialed up and sometimes it's dialed down. In this case, it was dialed up, and that was something that was briefed all the way up to the president a year ago. So it's important to remember that context, that it is a shocking headline, but also if you put it in the pattern, a year before that, back in 2018, U.S. generals in Afghanistan were saying that the Russian forces were arming the Taliban directly. So it was just sort of another step in that direction of escalation.
So we're sort of getting different messaging from the White House, right? Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary, said that the president was not briefed on this information because it was not fully verified. So can you give us a sense, Zeke, when intelligence agencies are at odds about information, does that prohibit it from being, taken up to the president? How does this sort of work?
Absolutely not. When it comes to information that is brought up to the president, or intelligence information in general, it is rarely 100% certain, unless some intelligence officer saw it with their own eyes. And that is rarely how most U.S. intelligence is gathered these days, or there's an intercept that's sort of the smoking gun. And even then, there's analysis and interpretation that goes on after the fact. Intelligence is always presented at degrees of confidence to the president and other national decision makers. So just because something was not verified doesn't mean that it would not have been brought to the president or could not have been brought to the president. And things like it have been brought to this president and other presidents before. So it is a bit of a weak argument and some disingenuous argument from the White House there, saying it was not brought to the president because it was not verified. Most intelligence, in fact, is not verified to beyond a shadow of a doubt. There are confidence intervals in terms of what intelligence officers believe is most likely, and they will present multiple alternatives sometimes to national decision makers. We think it's A, but the explanation could also be B or C even. It's not always binary even, but the notion that something has to be sort of totally ironclad before it's brought to the president is not how intelligence works. Talking to former White House officials, even current White House officials, they say that is not accurate.
So, Zeke, the president of the United States is tweeting this morning, and he tweeted this: "We are tracking down the two anarchists who threw paint on the magnificent George Washington statue in Manhattan. We have them on tape. They will be prosecuted and face 10 years in prison. Turn yourselves in now." The president is not tweeting about this, about trying to find out which American troops may have been targeted by these mercenaries paid for by Russia, these bounties that Russia was offering to the Taliban on our troops in Afghanistan. Now, if the president's claims of not being briefed about the bounty is true, what would that tell us about the relationship between the intelligence community and the President of the United States?
Well, we know that that relationship has been strained, and it was strained before the president got into office, even when there were, the early allegations regarding Russian interference in the 2016 election, and the intelligence community's unanimous assessment that Russia did interfere with the intent of helping the president's campaign. That was separate, and it often got conflated with the investigation to whether or not there was collusion or cooperation between the Trump campaign and Russia, which the Mueller report is not definitive on. It doesn't rule it out either. The president wasn't exonerated by that report, but there was no definitive conclusion reached by Robert Mueller in his report there. So, but the president has had a deep-seated resentment at times, certainly a suspicion of the intelligence community, career professionals there, believing that they are the source of leaks that have been damaging to his presidency, embarrassing to him personally, but whether it be accounts of his conversations with foreign leaders that would seem to most Americans to be non-traditional or alarming at times, or otherwise. So for the president to not be focused on the intelligence here, and to doubt intelligence publicly or to try to cast it as part of a broader conspiracy against him or something along those lines, is in some ways, keeping with the pattern we've seen from President Trump for 3.5 years now.
Zeke, I don't know if you can speak to this, but during the period of time that it's alleged this information was being investigated by the intelligence community, what was happening in Afghanistan? What was the relationship between the president and Putin, or the United States and Russia? I'm just trying to get a sense of how, something like this could complicate the attempt at diplomacy on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, this is all happening as the Trump administration was trying to negotiate a peace deal with the Taliban. And back in 2019 on the ground, my colleague James Porter writes that it was well known that the key priority of was to minimize U.S. casualties. That is always obviously a priority, but it was that it was viewed that any U.S. casualties at that time would be detrimental to the peace process. If you look back in September, a U.S. service member was killed right before the president was to have invited Taliban leaders to Camp David, and that delayed the peace talks by some months. So it sort of set against that any effort to, Russian efforts to try to harm or kill U.S. service members would be detrimental to that process, which would sort of keep the U.S. mired in Afghanistan for longer, which was not the president's stated objective, but would serve Russia's national interest by weakening the United States in its view. So that's sort of what's all, this is sort of geopolitics, and it's in some of its most crude manifestations, putting bounties on another nation's service members in a third country. But notably, as the president was, as this information was being circulated up within the federal government, up to the National Security Council, and some of our reporting up to the president himself, the president was talking about bringing Russia back into the G7, turning back into the G8, inviting other leaders to that. So there's not so much of a priority or prioritization of telling Russia to knock it off, or even punishing Russia for its actions.
Zeke, the Associated Press is also reporting that the then National Security Advisor John Bolton told his colleagues he briefed the president on the intelligence assessment in March of 2019. Bolton, as you know, has been doing several interviews over the last few weeks. We're also hearing, Zeke, that several former Trump officials say that in phone calls that the president had with, as you mentioned, Vladimir Putin and other world leaders, that the president was outplayed, that he was delusional. These are quotes from these former officials, including H.R. McMaster and others, that he may have even been a threat to national security. I guess the question I have is, why are we only hearing about this now? Why is this the first time we're hearing any of this, that these former officials who were part of the administration, who had these concerns or who received these intelligence assessments, as Bolton did way back in March of 2019, why is the American public only finding out about this now?
Well, to one part of it, in the case of this specific allegation, and this is just specific intelligence, it's partly because it was never presented to national decision makers as actionable. It was always, this is what we assess Russia to be doing right now, but there were no decisions made. But it seems that in the last several weeks now, there's been there have been discussions in terms of the policy responses. So more brought into it. But the broader question of why we've not heard national security officials and others more vocally speak out against the president when they basically say publicly what they've been sharing privately with reporters and other foreign leaders about the president for years is because of the sensitive nature of those conversations, that they're often classified. They're wary of and fearful of retaliation by the president, both criminally, but also using his megaphone, taking to Twitter about that. But when it comes to the president's conversations with foreign leaders, one of the key markers that we've seen in public that was released by the White House is that the memorandum of conversation, the record of the president's conversation with the president of Ukraine back at the center of the impeachment inquiry, as we all remember. And that struck everyone involved as a particularly unusual conversation and speaks to the president's unusual and troublesome stylings with foreign leaders. If that's the way he's talking to an ally, how could he? Do we imagine him to be talking to a foe? Obviously, Ambassador Bolton is out now with his book, and he's detailing some of those conversations. But even then, they are only a fraction of what he could reveal because he had to submit his book through the pre-publication clearance and process and remove classified information. A lot of that was direct quotes from the president's conversations with world leaders.
All right, Zeke Miller, thank you so much.
Thank you.